In my family, the name of Grandmother Edith was like a forbidden curse. The moment someone mentioned it at the dinner table, the atmosphere would instantly freeze. Even the clatter of knives and forks against porcelain seemed jarring. The neighbors secretly called her the witch, while others used a more refined term, the healer. But no matter the label, it couldn't hide the bone-chilling awe they felt. And I, Madeline, was the odd one who would drive every week through Vermont's winding country roads to that ivy-covered old house to ask about my future. It sounds absurd, but every word she spoke to me was branded into reality with uncanny precision, never failing. I remember that time when I was eagerly packing my suitcase, ready to fly to Hawaii with my husband Charles. The day before we left, I made a detour to Grandmother's house on a whim. She sat in her rocking chair, her bony fingers rubbing an amber medicine bottle. After listening to my joyful chatter, she slowly raised those deep, dark eyes and said only, "You cannot go with him." I froze, my smile stiffening on my face. She paused, then added, her voice cutting like an ice blade across glass, "Before you cancel everything, do one thing first, check the number called Irene in his phone." The blood rushed to my head, my nails dug into my palms, but I couldn't utter a single question. Yes, the whole family kept their distance from Grandmother. Not because she had ever done anything harmful, quite the opposite, she had never hurt anyone. But that innate gaze, capable of piercing through flesh and reaching into fate itself, sent chills down everyone's spine. That fear was like the suffocating pressure before a thunderstorm, or the moldy darkness that rushes out when you open a basement door late at night, irrational, yet bone deep. Grandmother lived alone on the outskirts of a small Vermont town, and the apple orchard behind her house was planted by her own hands in her youth. Now its branches were gnarled, and in autumn, the fruits hung like countless red eyes. The house itself was sturdy enough, but the outer walls were covered in wild vines, and dust had gathered on the windowsills over the years, not because she was lazy, but because she poured all her energy into her herbs. Bundles of dried lemon balm, chamomile, echinacea, and other unidentifiable roots hung under the porch, and the air was always filled with the sweet scent of honey mixed with the bitter earthiness of soil, creating an atmosphere both comforting and unsettling. On the kitchen shelves, glass jars stood in neat rows, their tinctures ranging from amber to pitch black. She never explained their uses, only said lightly, "When you need them, you'll understand." But I always suspected those bottles contained not just medicine, but the remnants of other people's fates. My mother Grace had avoided Grandmother like a snake since childhood. These stories weren't told to me by Grace, she wouldn't even utter the name Edith, but by my Aunt Dorothy, who, tipsy after a few glasses on Thanksgiving, would lower her voice and spill them out one by one. Dorothy said that when Grace was 8, she had seen a woman named Loretta from the neighboring county, her makeup ruined, stumble crying into Grandmother's kitchen in broad daylight. The two women locked themselves inside, and little Grace eavesdropped through the crack in the door. Loretta rasped, "Edith, will he ever come back?" Grandmother was silent for so long that Grace thought she had fallen asleep, until that cold voice finally spoke, "He will come back, but he will never return to you. Let go, Loretta. Stop degrading yourself." Loretta wailed and fled. 2 months later, her husband, who had been working on an out-of-state project, indeed returned, but with a blonde waitress from a local diner on his arm, openly checking into a hotel. The whole town whispered that Edith had cast a curse on the man, bewitching him. From that day on, the frost in Grace's eyes when she looked at Grandmother deepened. What truly caused the rift between Grace and Grandmother was another bloody coincidence. In July of Grace's 12th year, the heat wave baked the town like an oven, and all the children flocked to the creek to swim. At breakfast, Grandmother suddenly fixed her eyes on Grace and said for no apparent reason, "Don't go near the water today. The river will take you." Grace rolled her eyes, shoveled her cereal into her mouth, and ran off. Halfway there, a neighbor woman called out to her, begging for help catching a rabid dog that had escaped its fence. Grace cursed under her breath but chased after it for half an hour. In that short time, little Henry Parker, the neighbor's mischievous boy, swung on a rope swing over the deep pool and dove in, never surfacing again. The adults fished him out after 20 minutes, his face was blue, and after resuscitation, he lay comatose in the county hospital for a full week. Grace stood by the creek, watching Henry's mother wail in despair, and suddenly remembered grandmother's warning: if she hadn't chased the dog, she might have been the one to dive in at that moment. But she would have preferred it had been her than to bear the burden of being saved by a prophecy. From then on, Grace was convinced that grandmother's eyes could see the signposts of death, and that ability was more chilling than death itself. I asked my mother why we only visited grandmother on Easter and her birthday each year. Grace gritted her teeth, her eyes reddening. Because she can see things she shouldn't, and sitting next to her makes me feel like I'm standing naked in the snow. At every family gathering, Grace sat rigidly, with a polite smile as if dealing with a client, while my father Walter scoffed openly. A structural engineer at a manufacturing plant, his mind was full of tolerances, stress points, and finite element analysis, dismissing all of grandmother's prophecies as a country-old woman's probability game. Whenever Grace mentioned grandmother, he'd sneer. She says 100 things and happens to hit on a few. What's so remarkable about that? But that October, when Madeline was 15, grandmother wiped the smile off Walter's face for good. That day, as the family sat around the oak dining table, the warm steam of apple pie rising under the lamp, Walter was joking about the harvest, saying that if grandmother didn't tend to her orchard, the deer would strip it bare by next year. Grandmother suddenly put down her fork, staring straight at Walter with eyes like nails hammering into his chest. The whole table went silent, save for the crackling of firewood in the hearth. Word by word, she said, "Walter, you look as strong as an ox, but around 50, your heart will deliver a fatal blow. Get a checkup now. Don't gamble with your life." Walter's face flushed from red to purple. He slammed his plate aside, shattering the porcelain on the floor, and stormed out to the porch to light a cigarette, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't even flick the lighter. Grace turned to her mother, her gaze a mix of fear, resentment, and a desperate plea, as if to say, "Why must you tear our lives open in front of everyone?" We left early that evening. As the car pulled out of the driveway, I saw grandmother standing under the porch in the rearview mirror, her figure tiny, like a withered tree struck by lightning. Walter never got the checkup. He always said hospitals were for cowards, and that he knew his own body best. One Thursday, when he was 49, an utterly ordinary day, sunlight streaming through the blinds, he was hunched over correcting blueprints. He let out a grunt, clutched his left chest, and toppled from his chair, knocking over a coffee cup, black liquid spilling across the floor. The wail of the ambulance sirens tore through the office's silence. When they rushed in, he had already stopped breathing. My mother Grace got the call and collapsed on the kitchen floor, still clutching a half-peeled potato. She screamed as she dialed grandmother's number, crying into the receiver, "If you knew all along, why didn't you drag him to the hospital? Why do you always watch your prophecies come true?" On the other end of the line, grandmother was silent for so long that Grace thought she had hung up. Then came a reply so faint it was barely audible, "Because what I say has never truly been heard by anyone." Followed by a dial tone. And I, Madeline, standing behind my mother, suddenly remembered grandmother's words to me, "You cannot go with him." Trembling, I opened Charles's phone and scrolled to the chat history with someone named Irene. The flirtatious texts on the screen coiled around my throat like vipers. Only then did I understand that grandmother's prophecies were never curses, but the last door left ajar. Unfortunately, most who push it open only see the abyss beyond, forgetting that through the crack still filters a sliver of light. Walter's funeral was held on a gloomy day in late October. Vermont's maple leaves had turned half red, falling in gusts like countless unsent letters. The funeral home was filled with white chrysanthemums. Colleagues, neighbors, and distant relatives crowded the small parlor, some 40 or 50 people. Grace wore a black suit, standing by the casket with a nearly expressionless face, her eyes swollen as if she hadn't slept in 2 days. She mechanically repeated thank you for coming to each person who shook her hand, her voice hoarse and hollow. Madeline stood behind her mother, gazing at her father Walter's overly brightened face, touched up by the mortician, and felt a ridiculous pang of sorrow. Just a week before his 49th birthday, he'd sat at the kitchen table, wearing reading glasses and flipping through an engineering journal, telling Grace, "When I retire, I'm going to buy that apple orchard, cut down every tree, and build a modern glass house. Let that old hag keep her mumbo-jumbo." The old hag he meant was grandmother Edith. Grace said nothing, just kept chopping vegetables, the knife thudding heavily on the cutting board. But grandmother's prophecy came true, like a mine buried long ago beneath the rails, waiting for the train of time to roll over it, exact to the second. During the pastor's eulogy, Madeline's gaze drifted past the crowd to the empty seat by the back door. No one sat there, yet she felt someone should, a small, silent figure in a dark grey shawl. Edith had not come. Madeline couldn't tell if she was relieved or secretly disappointed. She knew that if grandmother set foot through that door, Grace would break down on the spot, and the other relatives would scatter like plague-fearing villagers. Her absence was, in a way, an act of mercy. As the service ended, Aunt Dorothy pulled Madeline aside, the smell of wine still on her breath, though she'd only had coffee at the funeral, and whispered, "She was right not to come, Madeline. Your mother hates her to the bone now. You know, your mother called me last night and cried for 2 hours straight, saying over and over, if she could see it, why didn't she force Walter to go? She wouldn't even say another firm word." Dorothy sighed, rubbing her temples. "But you know your grandmother. She only says a thing once. She never begs or repeats herself." Madeline nodded, her gaze drifting to the bare elm tree outside the funeral home. She remembered that October when she was 15, the apple pie on the table, the crackling hearth, grandmother's nail-like eyes, and her father's instantly reddened face. That sentence had been a thorn lodged in everyone's heart for 34 years, impossible to pull out or press down, until that Thursday when the cardiac arrest finally pierced through the flesh. Back home in the evening, Grace kicked off her heels and crouched on the wooden floor of the foyer, suddenly covering her face as her shoulders shook violently, yet no sound of crying came. Madeline walked over and gently placed a hand on her mother's back. Grace rasped, "You know what's the funniest part? Today at the funeral home, standing by your father's coffin, all I could think was she was right. She's never been wrong. And I hate her for being right." Madeline opened her mouth to speak, but her throat felt stuffed with cotton. Another weight pressed on her, heavier than her father's death. It had coiled in her stomach like a snake ever since grandmother said, "Check the number," called Irene in his phone, twisting day and night. 3 days after the funeral, Madeline could no longer deceive herself. That evening, Charles came home in a light grey suit, holding a bouquet of white roses to comfort her in her grief, he said. He arranged them in a vase, came up behind Madeline, wrapped his arms around her waist, and whispered against her ear, "Honey, I know this week's been tough, but we have to look forward. I didn't cancel the Hawaii tickets. How about we make it up next month?" Madeline went rigid. She stared at the white roses, but her mind echoed grandmother's words, "Before you cancel everything, do one thing first." She hadn't cancelled anything, the flight's change deadline had passed, she hadn't even called the airline. But she had done something else. Last night, while Charles showered, she'd rummaged through his old phone locked in the nightstand, charged it, and found the chat history with Irene. Those messages poured like boiling asphalt into her eyes. From 6 months earlier, "Today's meeting is so boring, miss you," to last week's "Her dad finally died, don't contact me these days, we'll meet after the storm passes." Madeline remembered clearly, on the afternoon her father died, she'd crouched in the hospital hallway, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Charles had texted her, "Honey, I'm working late, I'll pick you up tonight." At the exact same minute, he'd sent Irene another message, that old geezer finally kicked it. "We'll wait a bit on the inheritance." Madeline didn't expose him then. She swallowed the shards of glass and, when Charles came out of the shower, had already put the old phone back, her face streaked with tears as she said, "I was just missing Dad." That night she lay beside Charles, listening to his even breathing, feeling like she was lying next to a corpse that still drew breath. Now, at this moment, as he held her and said, "Let's look forward," Madeline finally spat out that mouthful of glass. She slowly turned to face him, looking into his eyes, her voice surprisingly calm. "Charles, who is Irene?" Charles's face looked as if he'd been slapped, the color draining and then rushing back in. He stepped back, his Adam's apple bobbing twice before he forced a laugh. What are you talking about?" "I said, Irene. The one you texted, we'll meet after her dad dies." Madeline pulled out a phone from her pocket, not the old one, but Charles's current phone, which she'd unlocked and scrolled through when he'd gone to the bathroom earlier. Want me to read out the call you made to her at 2 in the morning? Or shall I recite it for you? Charles's eyes darted between her face and the phone screen, his lips quivering before he finally managed. Madeline, have you lost your mind? You went through my phone? Madeline heard that and suddenly laughed. She remembered grandmother's deep, dark eyes, and how she had never raised her voice yet could silence a whole room. She mimicked grandmother's tone, enunciating each word. I didn't go through it. I just lit up the screen for you while you thought you'd hidden it flawlessly. Charles, are you still going to make excuses? Charles was silent for a long time. Outside, a maple leaf was blown against the glass behind him, sticking like a bloody handprint. Finally, his shoulders slumped, his voice barely a mumble. Madeline, I was going to tell you at the right time. It's not what you think between us, it's just work. Work-related enough to say baby, I miss you like crazy. Madeline raised the phone, the screen glaring bright. You're a structural engineer, not a screenwriter. At least rewrite your lines before telling the story. Charles was completely speechless. He leaned against the wall, hands buried in his hair, like a sack of skin with its bones removed. Watching him, Madeline suddenly felt an overwhelming disgust. Not because he had betrayed her, but because even his excuses were so pitiful, so devoid of dignity. She remembered grandmother saying, "You cannot go with him." Grandmother had known all along, had seen the ugly truth from that dim porch, and had only offered a single warning, because she knew that more words were useless. People only admit a wall exists after crashing into it. That night, Madeline packed a suitcase. She didn't slam the door, didn't yell, and at the threshold even looked back and said calmly, "Charles, I won't file for divorce. You'll do it, you owe me that." Then she opened the door and walked into the biting Vermont October wind, driving to grandmother's house. It was nearly midnight when Madeline arrived. The old house glowed under the moonlight like a grey beast dozing in the depths of the orchard. The herbs under the eaves rustled softly in the breeze. Before she could knock, the door opened, and Edith stood there in an old wool shawl, holding a steaming cup of chamomile tea, as if she had been waiting a long time. "Come in, child." Grandmother's voice sounded like dried leaves being crushed. "I left the door open for you." Madeline followed her into the kitchen. The familiar smells, honey, earth, bitter herbs, washed over her, and suddenly her nose stung and tears spilled. She sat at the worn oak table, pouring out everything about Charles between sobs, her sleeve soaked through. Edith sat across from her, not interrupting, not offering tissues, just listening quietly, sipping her tea occasionally, her gaze resting on the apple branches lit by moonlight outside the window. When Madeline finished, choking out "Grandma, why didn't you just tell me he had someone else?" Edith slowly turned her gaze back. She placed her withered hand over Madeline's and said something that left her completely stunned. "Because I wasn't sure then. I saw two forks in the road, one where he leaves with that woman and you're left alone, the other where he changes his mind, comes back crying for forgiveness, and you forgive him, only to spend the rest of your life wondering every night if he's lying again. Madeline, both paths lead to the same end, just by different routes. I couldn't choose for you. I could only tell you not to get on that plane with him, because on the first path, in that hotel in Hawaii, he'd answer that woman's call right in front of you, and that would hurt even more." Madeline's tears stopped. She stared blankly at grandmother, her lips trembling. "You can see that much?" Edith's aged face in the dim lamplight showed a strange serenity. "Not that much," she said softly. "Just sometimes. When I was young, I thought this ability meant I was chosen by God. Later I learned that those who are chosen are often the first to be burned. Your mother hates me, the villagers fear me, your father mocked me. But Madeline, you've always been different. You come to see me every week, you ask me about your future, you believe what I say. Do you know that in all these years, you're the only one who's ever treated me as a grandmother, not a witch?" Madeline gripped that withered hand. The warmth was thin, yet firm. She suddenly recalled a detail Aunt Dorothy had mentioned. Grandmother had once had a fiancé in her youth, the blacksmith's son from town, tall and kind to her. But one night, grandmother told him he would drown in a river within 6 months. The man didn't believe her, called her crazy, and broke off the engagement. Half a year later, while repairing a bridge in the neighboring town, He fell into the river and never came back. The whole town began calling her a witch from that day on. Grandma, Madeline rasped, do you ever regret it? Regret saying those things? Edith was silent for a long time. Wind swept fallen leaves from the orchard, scraping against the glass. She stood, walked to the shelf, took down the darkest black bottle, and poured a few drops of dark red liquid into Madeline's cooling tea. Drink this, and I'll tell you a secret. Madeline hesitated for a moment, then tipped it back. The liquid slid down her throat like a small flame, then melted into warmth spreading through her limbs. Edith sat back down, her gaze growing distant, as if watching a long-ago dusk disappear at the orchard's edge. I've regretted twice. The first was the blacksmith's son. I told him the truth, but he chose not to believe it, and I was right. After that I realized that truth, if no one will accept it, is cruel to speak. The second was your father Walter. That day at the table, I actually saw another path if he hadn't pushed his plate aside and stormed out, but instead sat back down in a daze. His heart would have already shown problems, but because he stayed seated without the emotional shock, he could have lived to 60. But I spoke that sentence, and it was that very sentence that enraged him, sealed off the good path. Madeline's eyes flew wide, almost dropping her teacup. What did you say? Edith closed her eyes, a stream of murky tears sliding down her cheek. I saw his death, but I was also part of that death. This mouth of mine, the prophecies I speak sometimes push fate toward what I've foreseen. Madeline, that's the price. You think you can save people, but the moment you speak, you become a link in the chain of cause and effect. Just as Madeline was reeling from the shock, a screech of brakes came from outside, followed by the slam of a car door, then footsteps, hurried, staggering, crushing twigs, and finally a fist pounding on the wooden door. Agnes, no, Edith. Open this door. What right do you have to do this to us? It was Grace. Her mother had come, and from the sound of it, she'd been drinking. Madeline rose to open the door, but Edith pressed her arm and shook her head slowly. Let her knock. She'll come in when she's tired. Sure enough, after a dozen seconds, the lock clicked open on its own. Grandmother had left the door unlocked, but hadn't gone to greet her. Grace burst in wearing a black coat covered in leaf bits and mud, hair disheveled, eyes red as a rabbit's, clutching a half-empty bottle of red wine. Seeing Madeline at the table, she paused, then turned her gaze to Edith, and the mix of alcohol and fury ignited like gasoline. What did you tell Madeline? Did you use your nonsense to drive her away from her husband again? Was destroying my life not enough? You have to ruin my daughters too? Edith didn't move, remaining seated, hands folded on the table, her expression like a millennia-weathered stone. Grace, sit down. I won't. Grace swung her arm, hurling the wine bottle to the floor, where it shattered, dark liquid splattering and glass scattering. Madeline flinched but didn't move. She saw grandmother's face twitch slightly, not with anger, not fear, but grief. Grace screamed hysterically, "Do you know how much I've suffered? I eavesdropped on you telling Loretta's fortune at 8, nearly drowned at 12, got married, and you had to curse my husband's death in front of him. And then he actually died. Are you happy now? Your mouth is deadlier than arsenic. You're not a healer, you're a curse." Edith slowly stood. She was nearly a head shorter than Grace, but when she straightened, Grace's volume involuntarily dropped. Grandmother walked around the table, stopped before Grace, and raised her age-spotted hand to place it gently on Grace's tear-streaked face. Grace, her voice as light as a feather settling on water, "I never cursed Walter. All I did with the forks in the road I saw in my life was mark the worst one and tell you there was a pit ahead. But every one of you, including you, Grace, believed I was the one digging the pit. You'd rather believe I'm an evil old witch than believe I'm your blood kin." Grace trembled violently, her teeth chattering, tears washing away her makeup to reveal 40-odd years of accumulated weariness. She violently knocked Edith's hand away, stumbling back until her back hit the doorframe with a dull thud. "Then tell me," she screamed hoarsely, "if you could see it, why didn't you lay out every path in full detail? Why didn't you use a whip to drag Walter to the hospital?" "Why?" "Because I tried." Edith cut her off, her tone wavering for the first time. "I tried. When you were 8, for Loretta's man, I told her, he'll come back but won't return to you, but she didn't believe it, chased him out of state, was publicly humiliated, and came back ready to jump off a bridge. When you were 12, I told you not to go near the water. You didn't fully believe me, but you did chase that dog and you think that was a coincidence. That was me calling the neighbor woman before you left, begging her to stop you. What do you think my prophecies are? Visions I see from a rocking chair? I used every means I had to push you toward the better path. The words struck like a thunderbolt, silencing the entire kitchen. Grace stood open-mouthed, her expression shifting from rage to bewilderment, then to a crumbling, almost broken disbelief. Madeline also stood, watching her grandmother's hunched yet resolute back, her throat clogged with burning embers. Edith gasped for breath, her aged hands gripping the table's edge, her voice trembling yet clear. Do you think I enjoy staring at those bloody crossroads every day? Do you think I enjoy watching my own daughter's husband collapse on his office desk, only to try 30 years earlier to shake his arrogance with a single get a checkup? Grace, I didn't kill your husband. He killed himself with that damned engineering faith that sealed my last door shut. I said it, and he called it probability. I said more, and he called me a lunatic. What could I do? Tie him up and force him into a CT scanner? The kitchen fell silent except for the wind outside and the faint crackling of embers in the hearth. Grace slowly slid to the floor, back against the doorframe, hands over her face, finally releasing the cry that had been lodged in her chest since the funeral. It didn't sound like an adult's sob, it was more like an 8-year-old girl crouched behind a door, hearing a woman named Loretta ask will he come back, and realizing for the first time that the truth in this world is often more desperate than lies. Madeline crouched beside her mother and pulled her into an embrace. Grace buried her face in her daughter's shoulder, mumbling indistinctly, I'm sorry, Mom. The word she hadn't uttered in over a decade finally escaped her lips. Edith stood 2 steps away, watching her daughter and granddaughter sobbing together, and slowly raised her sleeve to dab at the corner of her eye. She turned to the kitchen shelf, took down a clean glass, filled it halfway with warm water, added 3 drops from an amber bottle, and set it beside Grace. Drink this. It'll calm you. When the sun comes up, there's still much to do. Grace took the glass, her fingers still shaking, but she drank it down. She looked up at Edith, and for the first time, her reddened eyes lacked that guarded fear and distance, replaced by exhaustion and a tentative softness. She reached for Edith's wrist, holding it lightly, like holding a dried leaf that might crumble at any moment. Watching this, Madeline felt the mountain that had weighed on her heart for half her life loosen at a corner. She remembered that evening when they drove away from grandmother's house, the small figure in the rearview mirror, her father's furious exit, the cold words on Charles' phone, grandmother's words, I used every means I had. She suddenly understood that grandmother's prophecies had never been divine revelations from above, they were a series of faint street lamps she alone, through countless sleepless nights, had deduced with all her heart from the tangled forks of fate. But those lamps were too cold, and the paths they illuminated too perilous, so passers-by preferred to call them ghost lights rather than follow them an extra step. Wind from the orchard swept through, carrying the scent of rotting leaves and wet earth, rustling the dried chamomile hanging under the eaves. Madeline helped her mother Grace slowly rise from the floor. Grace's knees were stained with broken glass and dark wine, her steps unsteady, but her hand never let go of Edith's wrist. The 3 of them stood in the cramped kitchen, separated by the warm, dim glow of the oil lamp, none speaking. The embers in the hearth popped occasionally, like distant, intermittent applause. Later, looking back on that night, Madeline felt it was like an old photo album soaked through by rain, every page blurred, yet still faintly showing faces. Young Edith standing beside apple saplings, back straight, black hair flying like a flag, her father Walter at the head of the table, tapping his knuckles and saying, probability, that's all. I once won $20 on a lottery ticket. 8-year-old Grace crouched behind a door, nose pressed to the wood, hearing Loretta's heart-wrenching sobs and raising an invisible wall in her heart. And now that wall had finally cracked, and through the crack came not light, but a sour, searing warmth that rose from Grace's eyes to the corners of her mouth, taking shape as that mumbled I'm sorry. After handing Grace the calming drink, Edith returned to her chair, leaning back and closing her eyes, as if all the strength she'd stored over the years had been spent. Madeline noticed that her grandmother's breathing was shallower than usual, her chest rising and falling only slightly, her lips pressed into a nearly invisible line. She knelt and took grandmother's hand. It was cold as a corpse, the bones as knobby as twigs against her palm. "Grandma, you need rest too," Madeline whispered. "I'm staying tonight. I'll be right here with you." Edith didn't open her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched, as if suppressing a smile. "The last time your mother stayed the night here, she was 12. She slowly turned her face toward Grace, who was still slumped against the wall. The frosty edges in her gaze seemed softened by the night's dampness, leaving only a thin layer of glistening moisture. "Grace, go get the guest room ready. The sheets are on the top shelf of the wardrobe. They're old, but I aired them out before winter." Grace paused for 2 seconds, wiped her tear-streaked face, and pushed herself up with the doorframe, padding barefoot down the hallway. Madeline heard her kick a metal object, curse under her breath, then the creak of a cabinet door and the rustle of fabric being unfolded, carrying the scent of mothballs. That sound, in the deep night, felt remarkably solid, like fresh logs added to the stove. When Grace had made the bed and returned, Edith had fallen asleep in her chair, head tilted slightly, her shawl slipping from her shoulder to reveal a faded blue-gray cotton shirt beneath. Grace stood at the doorway watching her for a long moment, then walked over and with delicate care replaced the shawl. Madeline saw her mother's lips move silently as she bent down. She thought the shape was "I'm here." When she stepped back, her fingers brushed grandmother's shoulder in a clumsy, awkward gesture, as if she hadn't done it in years. None of them spoke again that night. Grace and Madeline squeezed onto the narrow iron bed in the guest room. The sheets smelled of sun-dried air and a faint sweet-bitter hint of chamomile. Grace lay on her side facing the wall, her breathing sounding deep, but Madeline knew she wasn't asleep because her shoulders trembled faintly. Madeline reached out and pressed her palm against her mother's back, feeling the ridges of her spine through the cotton nightgown. Grace had grown thin, she'd barely eaten since the funeral. But now, at last, she didn't resist the hand on her back. She even leaned back slightly, curling her legs like a child sleeping in her mother's arms. Madeline lay in the darkness for a long time, watching diamond-shaped patches of moonlight on the ceiling shift as clouds moved. She thought of Charles. No, not thought. He was like a splinter of iron lodged in her flesh, a dull ache when left alone, a sharp sting when touched. She'd left her phone off under her pillow all night. Now she suddenly wanted to check for his messages, apologies, explanations, frantic queries. But she held back, remembering grandmother's words. Both paths lead to the same end, just by different routes, and she wasn't ready to choose one yet. She just wanted to lie in this small, damp, apple-scented old house, pressed against her mother's trembling back, and wait for dawn. At daybreak, Madeline was woken by birdsong. Vermont's late autumn dawn had a crisp blue-gray quality, squeezing through the curtain gap to draw a thin bright line on the floor. Grace was already up, the indentation of her body on the bedding still held warmth, and from the kitchen came the clang of a spatula against iron and the faint smell of frying. Madeline shuffled out in her slippers and saw her mother at the stove, wearing Edith's faded floral apron, cracking eggs into a pan, a few thick slices of bread cut on the board beside her. Edith sat at the table with a mug of black coffee, an open, dog-eared herbal manual in front of her, reading glasses slid down to the tip of her nose. The scene was so ordinary that Madeline's nose suddenly ached. She had no memory of such a morning, her mother and grandmother at the same table, no distance between them, no stiff shoulders or polite smiles, just a lightly fried egg and a sit-down, eat while it's hot. Grace brought over the plates, her eyes meeting Madeline's for a second before darting away. She said, "The kitchen cabinets are a mess. It took me 5 minutes to find the salt. Your grandmother keeps salt and mugwort powder in the same jar." The complaint was soft, like pressing a fingertip to a fresh scab to test if it still hurt. Edith put down her glasses, took a sip of coffee, and said slowly, "That mugwort powder is for bath sachets. The salt is in the jar with the red lid next to it. You grabbed the wrong one, that's why you couldn't find it." Grace, spreading butter on the bread with her back turned, shrugged slightly. Madeline knew she was stifling a laugh. After breakfast, Grace said she had to go to town to handle Walter's company paperwork and insurance matters. Standing on the porch putting on her coat, she hesitated, then turned back to Edith. "I'll come back this afternoon after I'm done. Your apples are all over the ground. If you don't pick them up, they'll rot in the mud. Edith leaned against the doorframe and nodded, didn't say yes or no, but Madeline caught the faintest upward curve at the corner of her mouth. As Grace walked down the driveway, her steps were steadier than last night. The crisp click of her heels on fallen leaves faded at the bend in the dirt road. That morning, Madeline helped grandmother rehang the herbs that had gotten damp from dew under the porch. They worked quietly. Edith's hands were steady, her motions, bundling herbs, tying them with twine to the beams, a ritual repeated over decades, precise and thoughtless. As Madeline handed bundles up from the ladder, she suddenly asked, "Grandma, you said you called the neighbor to make Mom chase that dog. Did the neighbor know you could see those things?" Edith looked up from below, her grey hair nearly translucent in the morning light. She paused a few seconds before answering. She didn't know. "I just told her a stray dog would run into her yard before noon and asked her to call out to a black-haired little girl passing by to help catch it. The neighbor thought it was strange, but she's a warm-hearted person and did it." Madeline was stunned. "But, weren't you afraid she wouldn't?" "Yes." Edith bent to straighten the roots of a bundle of mint, her voice as calm as if reading a prescription. "But by then I'd already tried telling Grace directly. You should have seen her roll her eyes. So I had to take the long way, using each person like a pebble on a path. I'd nudge one, then another, hoping to guide her feet onto a different track. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Your father's case didn't work because I couldn't move him." Madeline remembered her father's face red with rage, the shattered porcelain skittering across the floor. She recalled how every word grandmother spoke had been like a nail hammered into wood, but her father's reaction had been more like a concrete wall, not only blocking his own ears but throwing the sound waves back at the speaker. After that meal, had grandmother sat alone in the kitchen late into the night, staring at her cold tea until dawn? Had she replayed it 1,000 times in her head? If she'd chosen different words, a different moment, a different tone, could she have turned the outcome? Madeline didn't ask, because she saw the answer in her grandmother's averted eyes as she sorted the mint. Around 10, as Madeline moved the ladder to the attic hatch, a loose floorboard caught her foot. She crouched to feel its edge and touched something cold, a small piece of tin wedged between the board and the wall. She tugged it out, a flat biscuit tin, its paint so faded only the letters soda remained, its edges rusted brown. She carried the tin down from the ladder and sat on the kitchen threshold to open it. Edith glanced over from the windowsill, still holding a length of twine, her expression shifting. She put the twine down and walked over slowly. Inside were dozens of letters, neatly folded and yellowed with age, the ink faded to shades of brown-gray. Madeline gently lifted the top one. The envelope read to Eleanor, no, to Edith, grandmother's real name. The date in the bottom right was September 1962, signed Your Thomas. Madeline looked up at grandmother. Edith settled beside her on the threshold, leaning against the doorframe, her voice softer. "Go ahead. You should see them." Madeline's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. The handwriting was neat, the kind of careful script of an apprentice carpenter used to rough tools but deliberately softening his hand. It began, "Edith, I don't know how to say this, but I've thought it over and have to tell you, I don't believe what you said. It's not that I don't believe you, I just don't believe a person's eyes can see through another's fate. If it's true that I'll drown in 6 months, then what's the point of writing this letter now? I ought to use those 6 months to do something. But whether I believe it or not, I have to ask you, if I stay away from all rivers and never touch water, can I survive?" The letter broke off there. A later line in more hasty handwriting read, "I regretted sending this letter 3 days ago. Keep it. If I come back, we'll talk. Thomas." Madeline turned the paper over. The back was blank, but the envelope seal bore a dark brown stain, like dried mud or something else. She looked up at grandmother, whose gaze was fixed on the distant orchard, the bare branches swaying in the wind. "When I received this letter," grandmother said, her voice like autumn's last dry leaf, "he had been dead for 13 days. He fell off a bridge, it was raining hard, the planks were slick, and he couldn't swim. I sat on this threshold holding the letter, thinking one thing. I pushed him toward the river. If I'd never spoken that sentence, he wouldn't have broken our engagement, wouldn't have gone to the neighboring town to work on that bridge, wouldn't have stood on that wet wooden plank that day. But if I'd kept silent, He'd have married me and lived beside me all his life, maybe to 60, 70, a natural end. How wonderful that would have been. She paused, reached into the tin for another letter, not opening it, just rubbing its edge with her thumb. But I didn't keep silent then. I was young and arrogant, thinking that seeing heaven's secrets gave me the duty to speak them. Your grandfather, yes, the blacksmith's son Thomas. After he died, I married your real grandfather, a plain farmer. Your mother Grace's own father. He knew nothing, never asked what I saw. We had a peaceful dozen years, and then he left too. Sickness, ordinary sickness, nothing to do with the eyes. But I still owe Thomas a life, I know that myself. Madeline held the crumpled letter, her throat too tight to breathe. She had always thought grandmother's prophecies were those of an observer standing behind a transparent screen, coolly watching fate's currents flow, then pointing them out to others. Now she understood, grandmother was never an observer, she was the stone thrown into the river, and the moment it hit the water, the ripples were already stirred by her own weight. Every word she spoke changed the outcome, some for the better, some for the worse, and she bore the consequences of all her misdirected efforts, spending most of her life alone in this vine-covered old house. Dozens more letters lay in the tin. Madeline flipped through them. Some were thanks. Ms. Edith, thank you for telling me not to take that road. I chose another, and now my child is 3. Some were curses. You old witch, you spread rumors that got my husband transferred. Now he drinks himself to death. Are you satisfied? Others had no signature, only a dried apple blossom, a strand of black hair, or a blank page, as if the writer had filled a mental page with words that never made it to paper. Madeline read them all, her fingertips grey with paper dust, her eyes full of tears, unsure which person to cry for. Edith sat beside her, placing a hand on her knee. Madeline, I showed you these today not for pity. She turned her face, those aged black eyes holding something hot and still, like embers burned through but still warm. I'm telling you this, if one day you find yourself seeing something, not seeing, but sensing something, in someone, at some turn, think carefully before you speak. Every word you say is like a stone thrown into water. The ripples will spread where you'll never see, but they'll keep moving forever. Madeline whipped her head around, staring into grandmother's eyes. You've sensed something in me too, haven't you? You're telling me this now because you see I'll be like you? Edith didn't answer right away. Wind from the orchard swept a few dead leaves over the threshold. Grandmother lowered her head and used her thumb to wipe a stray tear from Madeline's cheek, gently, slowly. That night in the kitchen, the tea I gave you, those few black drops, they weren't calming tea. There's something I brewed from the last winter apples and 7 roots from the orchard. I call it eye-opening tea. It won't make you see forks immediately, but it will sharpen your instincts like a whetted blade. When you truly need it, you'll know which way to turn. Yesterday when you told me about Charles, you said you'd felt something was off long before you looked through his phone, but you wouldn't admit it. After that tea, you won't pretend not to see anymore. Madeline listened, stunned, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. She hadn't even noticed the gesture, but Edith's gaze followed her fingers, and a very faint, knowing smile touched her lips. Go on, grandmother said. Go to town this afternoon and find your mother, help her with the insurance paperwork at the company. She'll feel awful sitting alone in a place like that. You know she hates filling out forms. And on your way, stop by the pharmacy at the town entrance and buy a pregnancy test. Madeline's hand froze on her belly, her face flushing from ear to neck. She opened her mouth to deny it, but her tongue tied itself in knots. Edith patted her hand, stood, and walked toward the kitchen, her back still small but steadier than ever. Don't ask how I know. I told you, that tea wasn't for nothing. Go on, while the light's still good. Madeline put the letters back in the tin, sealed it, and tucked it into the wooden cabinet by the threshold. She stood, brushed the dust off her pants, and turned to see grandmother at the stove shelling walnuts, her movements as unhurried as if her earlier words had been casual chatter. She suddenly felt this old house was like a huge, warm, slowly beating heart where all settled memories and unresolved fates resonated together, and she had finally become part of that resonance. That afternoon, Madeline drove into town. She went to the insurance building and found Grace standing in front of a vending machine, staring blankly, clutching a coin but not knowing which button to press. Madeline walked over and pressed the hot cocoa button for her. Grace took a sip, leaving a brown milk mustache on her upper lip. She looked both funny and fragile. They sat side by side on a bench in the hallway, and after a while Grace said, "Your grandmother sent me home with a jar of honey this morning, said it's good for sleep. She never used to give me things, knowing I wouldn't take them." Madeline smiled, leaning her shoulder against her mother's. "She's giving now, so take it." After the insurance office, Madeline went to the pharmacy at the town entrance. She stood in front of the pregnancy test shelf for a full 5 minutes before grabbing 2 different brands, stuffing them in a brown paper bag and into her coat pocket. By the time she got back to the old house, dusk was settling. Edith was in the kitchen slicing apples, the knife falling evenly, a row of thin, uniform slices piling on the board. Grace was back too, crouching by the stove to feed the fire. Its glow lit her profile, warming the weariness in her eyes. Madeline locked herself in the bathroom, her heart pounding like a drum. 5 minutes later, staring at the 2 clear red lines on the plastic stick, she held her breath for 3 full seconds, then slowly let out a long, hot sigh. She wrapped the test in a tissue, tucked it in her pocket, and pushed open the door. The kitchen's warm yellow light, the sweet and sour scent of apples, her mother and grandmother side by side at the table discussing the harvest, it all framed a picture, and she was about to add a new stroke. She stood in the hallway and cleared her throat. Grace and Edith looked up at the same time. Madeline gripped the plastic stick in her pocket, her lips moving before she finally said only, "Is dinner ready? I'm hungry." Edith went back to slicing apples, the subtle curve at the corner of her mouth reappearing, like an apple blossom bud swelling beneath the frozen ground. Grace stood to fetch the soup pot, accidentally kicking over the firewood basket with a clatter. She cursed "damn it" and scrambled to pick it up. Madeline leaned against the doorframe watching them, and suddenly felt that this winter might not be as cold as she'd feared. That night they sat around the table, sharing a bowl of hot pumpkin soup and freshly baked apple pie. Grace complained that Edith's pie was too sweet. Edith retorted, "When you were little, you'd pour sugar into your mouth straight from the jar." Grace rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Madeline quietly finished 2 slices, pushing the pregnancy test to the safest corner of her mind for now. She'd wait for a better time, when the rift between her mother and grandmother had healed a little more, when she'd cleared up the mess with Charles, when the orchard had bloomed its last flowers before winter. But she didn't know that as she sipped her soup, Edith had glanced at her belly in the dim light, then looked out into the night. The steam from grandmother's chamomile tea fogged the window pane into a white haze. What she saw in that haze, only she knew. She just blew gently on her tea, finished it, and, as if seeing nothing, called for Grace to add another spoonful of soup. That night, as Madeline lay in the guest bed, the tissue-wrapped test in her pocket felt like a hot piece of iron against her thigh, its weight palpable even through the fabric. Grace slept beside her, breathing deep and even, occasionally turning and tugging the blanket away, mumbling something incoherent in her sleep. Madeline stared at the moonlit ceiling, counting days in her head. 8 weeks. Grandmother had said 8 weeks, and her own reckoning matched. Her last period had been in early September, when Charles had still held her waist and said, "We need to have a baby soon, my parents are dying for grandchildren." She'd thought it was love then. Now looking back, it was just another of his lies, told to her and to that woman Irene, juggling both, leaving both empty. She pressed her palm to her belly. It was still flat, no sign of change, but her fingertips seemed to sense an almost imperceptible pulse, like a seed buried deep underground turning over before sprouting. She remembered grandmother saying, "This child, I saw her 30 years ago." That sentence sent more chills than the 2 lines on the pregnancy test. 30 years ago, grandmother was in her early 50s, in her prime. Madeline wasn't even born yet, and the apple orchard in this Vermont town hadn't grown to its current size. Thomas's letter still lay at the bottom of the biscuit tin. Grandmother sat alone on the threshold, staring at the not yet planted saplings, already seeing a girl who hadn't yet been conceived altering everyone's fate at 18. Her head spinning, Madeline turned her face into the pillow. The scents of chamomile and sun-dried cotton filled her nose, and she finally drifted off. She dreamed not of the orchard, not of Charles, not even of grandmother's face, only a thick, warm orange glow, like dusk filtering through honeyed glass, and in that light someone was laughing, a little girl with red hair, but her face was blurred. Madeline chased her through a field, across an iron bridge, to a stream where a broken rope swing hung over the water. She stood on the bank looking down. The reflection in the water was her own face, but older, with grey at the temples and deep lines at the corners of her eyes, and in those eyes, something familiar, a quiet, sharp, dull-blade coldness she knew. They were grandmother's eyes. She woke with a start. It was already full daylight. Grace wasn't beside her. The covers were folded neatly at the foot of the bed, military style. Madeline sat up, rubbed her face, and found her pillow damp, sweat or tears, she didn't know, but it had dried, leaving a faint watermark. She got dressed and went out. The living room was empty, but the kitchen counter held a bowl of oatmeal and a note in Grace's crooked handwriting. I went to the post office. Grandma's in the backyard picking apples. The porridge is in the pot, heat it up yourself. Madeline ate the porridge, washed the bowl, and pushed open the back door to the orchard. Morning light spilled down, illuminating apples red and green on the ground, some half-rotted, with fruit flies buzzing above them. Edith crouched beneath a tree in her blue-grey cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her wrists like dried twigs, mud and grass caught between her fingers. Beside her was a woven basket already holding a dozen or so usable fruits. Madeline crouched beside her, picked up an apple, wiped it on her sleeve, and bit into it, so tart she squinted. Edith didn't look up, her hands never stopping as she gently nudged a half-rotten apple into the leaf pile beside her. "Sleep well?" she asked, as casually as discussing the weather. "Had a dream," Madeline said, swallowing the sour bite. "I dreamed of a river with a swing hanging over it. I stood on the bank, and in the water, the reflection had your eyes." Edith's hands paused for a moment, then continued picking. "What were you chasing in the dream?" "A little girl with red hair. I didn't catch her." Grandmother straightened, her knees giving a soft crack, and leaned against the trunk as she turned to face Madeline. Morning light turned her grey hair to silver, her wrinkles like a dry riverbed, yet her eyes in the light were exceptionally clear, like amber polished over years. "I used to have the exact same dream when I was little. I lived in Pittsburgh then, before moving to Vermont, before planting this orchard, before even knowing Thomas. I chased a red-haired girl across an iron bridge. The river below was muddy and the swing was broken, floating on the water. I told my mother when I woke up, and she told me not to talk about it. Later I moved here, met Thomas, lost him, married, had Grace, and then Grace had you. When you were born, I rushed to the hospital. The nurse brought out a little red-haired bundle, and the moment I saw your face, I knew it was the girl from my dream." Madeline nearly dropped the apple. Her mouth hung open, her voice catching before she could force out, "And in your dream, did you catch me?" Edith lowered her head, placed the last apple in the basket, and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I caught you. You were crouched by the river, you turned and smiled at me, then jumped into the water and vanished. I sat on the bank and cried until I woke up. I had that dream for 40 years, and after the day you were born, it never came again." Madeline felt a chill run up her spine, a cold draft rising from her lower back. She instinctively looked down at her belly, then back at grandmother. Edith's gaze followed, and she reached out with her mud and grass-stained hands, placing one warm, rough palm over Madeline's. "You tested last night." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Madeline nodded, her throat tight with ache. "When are you going to tell your mother?" "I don't know." Her voice was like sandpaper scraping wood. "She's just barely eased up. Dad's not even past the 7th-week observance. If I tell her now I'm carrying Charles's child, she'll lose it." Edith let go, picked up the basket of apples, and walked toward the house. Madeline followed, stepping on dead leaves and stems, the crunching sound underfoot. At the porch, grandmother turned. Sunlight from behind outlined her in a dark gold edge. "Your mother's not as fragile as you think," she said. "She nearly drowned at 12, cut me off at 15, got laid off from your father's engineering firm at 37, and became a widow at 49. She's been carrying loads her whole life, just without saying a word. Tell her the truth. She'll yell at you at first, cry, storm outside for a smoke, but the next morning she'll still make you oatmeal. Would you believe that?" Madeline didn't answer, but her eyes stung. She leaned against the doorframe, watching grandmother dump the apples into the sink, turn on the faucet, and scrub each one with her thin fingers, as carefully as if tending a baby. Madeline suddenly felt that this kitchen, this orchard, this small old woman, felt more like home than anything she'd known in her previous 20-some years. That afternoon Grace returned from town, carrying a bag of mail and a knitting magazine she'd picked up at the post office, grumbling about the long line. She hung her coat by the door, peered toward the kitchen, and saw Madeline sitting at the table peeling apples, while Edith stirred a pot of jam, the dark red liquid bubbling with a sweet aroma filling the room. Grace paused, then came in and sat beside Madeline, picking up the long apple peel Madeline had just cut and curling it around her finger like a ring. "Madeline," Grace began, her tone casual, as if discussing dinner, "you tossed and turned all night. I woke up several times. Is there something you haven't told me?" The peeler slipped in Madeline's hand, nearly cutting her thumb. She set the knife and apple down, turning to face her mother. Grace wasn't looking at her, she was fiddling with the apple peel ring, which had now gone limp, like a faded ring. Edith, with her back to them, was still stirring the jam, but Madeline noticed her stirring slow, as if deliberately leaving a pause. Madeline took a deep breath, reached out with her apple juice-stained hand, and took Grace's fingers. "Mom, I'm pregnant. Charles 8 weeks. The air in the kitchen seemed to thin by 2/3. Grace's fingers froze in her palm, the apple peel snapped in two and fell onto the table. She slowly looked up at Madeline's face, those dark eyes, so like grandmother's, churned with something, first shock, then anger, then something deeper, stiller, like a bottomless pool struck by a stone, ripples spreading but the depths never visible. Madeline expected an explosion. She braced herself for shouting, cursing, pushing, even a thrown plate. But Grace just pulled her hand back, pinched the bridge of her nose with her fingertips, and walked to the stove. She took the long wooden spoon from Edith, stirred the jam twice, then set it down. She stood with her back to them for about 10 seconds, her shoulders rose and fell once, and when she turned, her eyes were red, but her voice was surprisingly steady. "Does Charles know?" Madeline shook her head. "Do you plan to tell him?" Madeline shook her head again, more slowly. "He's leaving anyway. This child is mine. I don't want any extra connection with him." Grace stared at her for a moment, lips pressed into a thin line. They trembled, but she clenched her jaw to keep them still. Then she walked back, picked up the peeler and the half-peeled apple, and resumed peeling, the long strip falling in curls onto the table, swift and steady, as if peeling away an outer shell. "Fine," Grace said, eyes fixed on the blade, not looking up. "Keep it. I'll help. My pension's enough, your father's insurance is enough, and the orchard apples sell for a few baskets each year. Move back here. I'll clear the upstairs study for a nursery." Madeline's nose burned. Before the tears could come, she threw her arms around her mother's neck, burying her face in Grace's shoulder. Grace's hands froze mid-air, the knife paused, she raised her apple juice-stained arms, hesitated, then placed them on her daughter's back. She patted twice, very gently, as if afraid to break something. Edith stood at the stove, back to them, lifting the jam pot off the heat and setting it on the counter to cool. Through her tears, from over her mother's shoulder, Madeline saw grandmother's shoulder blades tremble under the faded blue cotton shirt. But she didn't turn around, she just reached for an empty glass jar on the windowsill and began filling it with the cooling jam, her movements twice as slow as usual. That evening, for once, Grace opened a dusty bottle of apple brandy from the top shelf of the cabinet, poured herself a finger-high glass, and poured Madeline half a glass, then pulled it back and exchanged it for hot milk. Edith, who didn't drink, sat with her chamomile tea, and the three gathered around the table. On it lay the knitting magazine from town, one page dog-eared with a pattern for baby booties. "Let me be clear," Grace said, sipping the brandy, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'm not knitting. I can only do scarves, the straight kind, and they end up uneven. If the baby wears my booties, she'll probably trip and become a cripple." Madeline laughed so hard she choked on her milk, coughing tears. Edith handed her a dry towel from the shelf, the curve at the corner of her mouth a little deeper than before. Outside, the orchard branches swayed in the darkness, making faint rustling sounds, like countless dry hands gently clapping. November passed, and the first frost of early winter fell. Madeline had already moved into the upstairs study of the old house. Grace and Edith spent 3 days clearing out 30-odd years of old boxes, newspapers, and broken wicker chairs, making a corner by the window. Edith found an old wooden rocking chair in the shed, recoated it with tung oil, and added a thick cushion, placing it by the window. She said it was the one Grace had used as a baby. Grace herself didn't remember until she sat in it, and it creaked. She paused, closed her eyes, and said nothing for a while. Madeline's morning sickness peaked in the 7th week. She threw up violently every morning, Grace standing at the bathroom door with warm water, her hand on Madeline's back now practiced. Edith calmly brewed tea, chamomile, mint, and 2 slices of dried ginger, which eased the churning in her stomach. Madeline would sit in the rocker, clutching the warm cup, watching the orchard leaves turn from gold to bare, then a light snow dusting the branches white. The days passed, unhurried. A week before Christmas, Aunt Dorothy came by with a ham and candied fruit. When she saw Madeline's slightly rounded belly, the box of fruit slipped from her hands and clattered on the foyer floor. She stood frozen for 10 full seconds, then looked at Grace, who shrugged with an expression of weary resignation Madeline had never seen before. Dorothy picked up the fruit, strode over to Madeline, crouched, and gently touched her belly through her sweater, muttering, "Oh my God, this little girl's going to turn things upside down. Her grandmother's powers are probably passed down to her. You women in this family get weirder and weirder." "Dorothy," Grace called from behind, her tone a clear warning.